Welcome to Property Power Talks, the exclusive podcast for NB Property Law. I'm your host, Kayleigh Swift, and each episode will dive into cutting-edge insights on property law, probate, estate planning strategies, and seamless estate administration. Whether you're a property investor, homeowner, industry professional, planning your estate, or wanting to understand how estate administrations work, then our expert discussions will empower you with the knowledge you need to navigate the complexities of property and estate planning law with confidence. Let's unlock the power of property and estate planning law together. Thank you everyone for joining us today. What we're going to be talking about today is maximising property investments in Australia. So looking at the insights into both residential and commercial property markets. So my name's Kayleigh Swift. I'm one of the directors here at NB Property Law. So a little bit about us. We offer a personalised proactive advice to our clients to help them minimise the risk and take the stress out of their next property transaction or even estate planning matter. We're more than just a team of legal experts. We're dedicated problem solvers committed to creating personalised solutions to guide our clients forward. We do everything from residential to commercial property law matters, and we're here to provide the clarity and guidance our clients need to help them find a way forward. Now I'll hand over to Sebastian to introduce himself now as well.
Hello everyone, my name's Sebastian Ferranda, or Seb Ferranda. Only my mother calls me Sebastian when she's upset. I am a partner and advisor at Koda Capital. We have an office here in Brisbane. Koda's a bit of a different approach to wealth management in the sense that there's three main things about us that are different. Primary is that we're an independent firm with no conflicts in the way we give advice. So there is no relationship with the investment managers. There is no kind of backdoor fees. The only way that something ends up in a client portfolio is because we genuinely believe it's the best thing for that client. And then it flows into the second thing that makes us a bit different, which is that we build these long-term plans as opposed to a collection of uncorrelated ideas that may be single stocks or good ideas. So we don't do that. We try to build this we take this endowment style approach, which then builds this long-term portfolios designed to meet these plans. And then the third thing about us that's quite different is we've got this alternative asset platform and a collection of alternative and uncorrelated investment ideas, which is very unique. And in the sense, I spent a long time working in this business in the US, and the platform is as good as any platform that I saw in the US. And so whenever we're talking to clients, what we try and do is deliver that kind of a little bit of a different approach. And what we're going to talk about today is another example of maybe a different approach that we take in the way we build client portfolios and advise clients on where to make investments.
Wonderful. So a bit of what we're going to cover off on. So we're going to go through why people actually tend to invest in residential property compared to commercial. We'll look at the property taxes involved. So talking about land tax, capital gains, withholding, also foreign resident taxes, additional foreign acquirers duty, and the Foreign Investment Review Board taxes too. We'll have a bit of a discussion around commercial and retail leasing and the actual charges that we can on-charge to tenants in those properties. In terms of the Queensland statistics, like looking at what commercial versus residential properties have to offer. Then Seb's going to take us through, issues with investing in Australia, the high costs that are involved in investing in property, what are the low liquidity for property investments, and also why the yields may be lower for property investment as well to other investments. So to start off with, we're going to go through why people actually tend to invest in residential property compared to commercial. So often it's lower entry costs. So with a residential property purchase, most banks will lend to people 20% deposit. They don't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. Obviously, you can have some banks that will offer a lower deposit, it might be 5%, but they still will pay what's called lender's mortgage insurance on top of that. Whereas commercial property investment, most banks will want the client to have an actual 30% deposit for that. There's also strong capital growth that's seen with the residential properties, and also the vacancy time is quite minimal with residential properties. So often at the moment the vacancy rate's quite low, whereas sometimes with commercial properties they can take a little bit more longer to actually release those premises. The actual costs involved as well in leasing residential property are generally quite substantially less than what they are with commercial properties, and also residential properties offer clients the ability to have negative gearing potentially, depending what the the structure and how the property is set up. And you generally don't have to be paying GST either on residential property purchases, as it's residential premises, so it's generally just input taxed. In terms of it, also generally finding, tenants, like I said before, it is, vacancy rates are generally quite minimal because it is a quick turnaround often, at the moment. Properties are being leased within a month, so that also helps. In terms of, though, with any property, there's always taxes involved. One of the main ones, which is quite a significant amount that buyers will pay, is what's called transfer duty. A lot of people formerly know this as stamp duty. Now, that's a state-based tax on all dutiable transactions. So any property purchased in Queensland, each state, though, do have their own stamp duty regulations and legislation that it is in place. So a dutiable transaction basically includes the transfer of any dutiable property. Can be an agreement for the transfer of the dutiable property. It can be a vesting of the dutiable property. It could be a partnership acquisition, or the creation or termination of a trust of dutiable property, or a trust acquisition or surrender. So basically, dutiable property in Queensland is land in Queensland, a transferable site area, an existing right that's being transferred, or even a Queensland business asset that's being transferred, or any other chattel basically in Queensland. So in terms of what the transfer duty rates are, it depends on what the property purchase amount is as to what it is. The Queensland Revenue Office in Queensland is the one that regulates transfer duty, and they have their own online calculator that can plug in, what the property purchase amount is, and it will tell you how much transfer duty you need to pay. With residential property, though, there is also concessions available if the property is going to be a principal place of residence, and also further concessions if it's a first home purchase and under the certain threshold. So next one we're going to look at is property taxes in terms of foreign resident taxes. So that's what we're talking about here, is the additional foreign acquirers duty tax and also Foreign Investment Review Board approval. So the Foreign Investment Review Board approval is required if you're actually a foreign investor seeking to buy property in Australia. Whilst you're not an actual tax resident, you are required to pay an application fee to the ATO when making the application. So this fee is based on the value of the property that you're actually seeking approval to purchase. So there's certain thresholds that the ATO set out, and if you're in that certain bracket, then it'll be an X amount of dollars for that one. Now, if the property is not occupied or rented out for 6 months or more than a year, you also need to pay a vacancy fee, which is based on the actual application fee as well. So there's a couple of taxes there that may require you to pay on top of, just your normal purchase costs. And the additional foreign acquirers duty one that I'm talking about now, that's a state-based one. That's again regulated by the Queensland Revenue Office. That's in addition to transfer duty. So as a foreign buyer, you'll have to get your FIRB approval through the ATO, which is federal. Then you'll pay transfer duty to state as a state tax, and then you'll also pay on top of that a additional foreign acquirers duty in addition to the transfer duty. The other property tax as well that we probably need to look at, which is a big one that a lot of people, depending on the amount of properties they own and the value of them, is land tax. Land tax, again, is another state-based tax, which is regulated by Queensland Revenue Office, and it's payable on freehold land. And if you are liable when the taxable value of all your land, it must be $350,000 or more for absentees, companies and trustees of trust and superannuation funds. Otherwise, the threshold is $600,000 or more for individuals and trustees of special disability trusts. So if the land is exempt from land tax, though, the taxable value of the land is excluded when actually calculating the total value of all your land. So, for example, if it is a principal place of residence, then that exemption will give you what's called the home exemption. And so if you own that land as an individual or as trustee of a trust or super fund, you may likely be eligible for this exemption to provide you use the property actually as your home. Again, land tax, as it's a state-based tax, it is different in Queensland to other states. So each state has their own different legislation and regime in regards to that. The other exemptions that may be potentially able to be applied for by owners of land is what's called the primary production exemption. You've also got charitable institution exemptions, movable dwellings, so for caravan parks, also aged care and retirement villages, any supported accommodation, and also not-for-profit societies, clubs and associations. So we'll move on then to basically the capital gains tax. So this is again federal, so regulated by ATO. So capital gains tax is the tax you're going to pay on the profits from disposing of the assets, so generally selling them. So capital gains is included in your income when you do your annual tax return. So if you sell your main residence, you would generally be exempt from that capital gains tax. So if when you sell your property valued at $750,000 or more, the ATO requires you now to also pay capital gain tax at settlement. So the contract, this is for foreigners as well. So the contract imposes an obligation on the buyer to withhold 12.5% of the purchase price and actually pay it to the ATO on behalf of the seller. So to avoid having to pay this in settlement, the seller, what we have to do now for clients is apply for a clearance certificate. And basically this clearance certificate is only given to Australian residents for tax purposes. So the ATO put this requirement in place essentially to make sure that foreigners weren't, holding property, selling it, once they're leaving the country and then never paying the capital gains tax on it. From next year, though, changes will come into place for this tax where there will be no threshold on needing this foreign resident capital gains withholding certificate. So basically any property that's sold, all sellers will need to have this particular certificate, which their solicitor will help them in terms of actually applying for it for them. So now looking at leasing then, so we've looked at, the taxes and things that are involved with owning property, particularly in Queensland. With the commercial property though, and properties that are deemed, to be retail space, we can lease them out. The good thing though is we can on-charge a lot of the outgoings for them. So things like insurances, the rates that we're paying, land tax, they can all be on-charged to the actual tenants in the property. So basically the landlord can include in the lease that they're recovering these amounts from the tenant, but they do need to be clearly outlined in the actual lease agreement that they have with those tenants. However, there is another piece of legislation in Queensland, which is the Retail Shop Leases Act, which regulates what outgoings can actually be on charge to tenants. So for retail spaces, the lessor's reasonable expenses directly attributable to the operation, maintenance or repair of the centre or building. So this is all regulated under Section 7 of that piece of legislation. It then goes on to state as well that so any charges, levies, premiums, rates or taxes payable because the lessor is the owner of the building or the land or which the centre is situated on can be on charge to the tenant. So when it's talking about levies here, that's talking as well a lot of properties will be part of a body corporate, so any body corporate levies as well that are payable, they can also be on charge to the tenants, which is obviously quite beneficial to the actual landlord who's the owner of the building, because they're not actually having to make sure that they're paying all these costs on top of their potentially repayments for the land. So with commercial or non-retail leases, they allow for a broader range basically of outgoings to be recovered from the lessee. So these include the rates, so this can be water and sewage charges as well, the land tax, building insurance costs, the body corporate fees, also the property management fees. So anyone that you've got that's managing the property for you and charging a fee, they can be on charge. All the repairs, any cleaning, gardening, maintenance costs, it can all be on charge to the tenant. Generally, any works that are of a capital nature and improvements are not recoverable though, and that will be up to the landlord to pay for them directly. So a commercial property as opposed to a retail property, when leasing it out, we can on charge a little bit more than what we could just a retail property due to the legislation that's in place here in Queensland. So moving on then, looking basically at commercial versus residential property and, the differences between them and, how the Queensland statistics, dictate, where we're at with them. So I'm looking at Queensland specifically, like our median house prices or unit prices. Basically, this is from 2023. So houses in the metro area median price was $827,000 with a median rent of $595. Now, this is median rental yield then of 3.9%. Our units in Metro Queensland areas are 550,000, rent 550, which is a yield of 5.5%. In our regional areas, though, houses are median price of 595,000 with rent at 575, which gives a yield of 5.2%. And then the regional units, they're getting a median price of around 561,000 with a median rent of 500,000, which gives the yield of 4.8%. So all these figures are basically from CoreLogic. When we look at commercial property on the other side, the yields for 2022, so for the Brisbane North area, retail we're getting around 4.5 to 5.5%, whereas office space was getting 6 to 6.5% and industrial around 5 to 6%. So we can see that obviously offices were the most biggest yields that we had in the Brisbane North. For the south side of Brisbane, though, we had retail at 5.5 to 6%, which is quite a bit higher than what the north side was getting. Offices, though, were a bit lower at 5.75 to 6.25, whereas industrial was slightly higher at 5.5 to 6% on the south side of Brisbane. So again, talking about Brisbane's commercial property market, then obviously there has been some strong growth prospects due to basically population increase investments. Obviously, we've had a lot of businesses that have migrated, from southern states, started opening head offices and things here in Brisbane as opposed to southern states. That's also seen quite a higher demand for office space, particularly in the CBD, and the industrial sector actually still remains healthy with strong demand for well-located properties. So the retail sector, though, is experiencing growth as well, especially for some of those smaller convenience and neighbourhood centre areas. So I suppose the key takeaways in terms of residential property investment in Queensland, while it does offer moderate rental yields, particularly for units, commercial property investment in Brisbane still does present attractive opportunities. It's showing strong demands and relatively high yields, especially in the office and industrial sectors. So investors basically need to be considering what this specific location and property type is when making just investment decisions, looking at things such as yield, what are the vacancy rates in that area, because they can really vary quite significantly across the different areas, regions and sections within Queensland. Kind of it for me. I'm going to pass on now to Sebastian to take us through why Australian investors have been let down, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Sebastian.
It sounds a bit confronting, Kayleigh, doesn't it?
It is.
Been let down. But I'm going to explain it to you, because I think my premise is interesting in that I think a lot of people who are kind of around my vintage, I'm old, are going to nod just because we've heard this our whole lives. And as young kids, and look, just to reiterate again, my name's Sebastian Ferranda. I'm a partner and advisor here at Koda Capital. We're in office here in the Brisbane CBD. And like I said earlier, we take a bit of a different approach when we're building portfolios for clients. And one of them is around this topic. And the topic is that since a relatively young age, if you're even a little bit interested, in investing in Australia, you heard two relatively broad truisms that when you were told, you just kind of went along with it. And one is that if you wanted to get wealthy, there were two paths. And path one was that Australian shares that pay a fully franked dividend are a wonderful way to get wealthy. And the second one is to go and buy residential real estate because it always goes up. And the truth is that both those things are wrong. They're wrong and wrong. Now, we're not going to cover Australian shares today, but please feel free to reach out to anyone who is interested in understanding the logic behind the Aussie shares one as well, because I'm going to obviously walk through the real estate one. But to be clear, and I want to be clear about a couple of things. So the first thing is, this is not me saying that had you invested in Australian shares or had you invested in residential real estate, that you didn't make any money. What I am saying is that you took a requisite amount of risk, and for that risk, you were not paid appropriately. There were other things that paid you better for the same risk or paid you the same for lower risk. That's what I'm trying to get at. And in particular, I think the other thing to make clear here is I'm not for a second suggesting that people shouldn't go and buy a residential home to go and live in. You absolutely should do that. For the record, I have done that. What I am saying, though, is to the extent that investors have a marginal investment dollar and you're choosing where to put it, residential real estate is a subpar place to put it because the costs are high. Well, there's three main reasons. There's many reasons, I think, but there's three big ones that I'll cover today. One is that the costs are high. The second is that liquidity is low. And the third is that the yields are also low. And also, just to clarify one other thing, I'm just covering residential real estate today. If for people who are considering commercial real estate or considering real estate development or land banking or a variety of other real estate plays, that's not what I'm covering today. Those things come with requisitely higher risk than residential real estate. And as a result, you should and will probably get paid for that risk if you're good at kind of doing this, right? Sorry, Kayleigh, how do I move to the next slide? Thank you. So reason one is the high costs. And I'm not going to walk through the costs. I'm just going to tell you a story. A little while ago, there's an accountant I know who asked me to speak at a meeting she has every year. She asked me to give this little economic update. And cut a long story short, in one of the comments that I made this comment about residential real estate not being a subpar investment vehicle. And this gentleman in the crowd quite literally stood up in the crowd and kind of pointed at me and said, I think you're wrong. And I asked my partner, the accountant who invited me, I said, do you mind if I answer this gentleman? Look, I didn't want this person to be her biggest client. So I said, do you mind if I answer this gentleman? She said, no. So I said to him, look, do you mind if I ask you why you think that? And he told me the story that his son had bought this beautiful home on the north side of Brisbane. He paid $5.95 million for it. He spent $200,000 doing it up right before he sold it. And 5 years later, he got $8 million for it. So in his eyes, his son made more than $2 million in 5 years. That's an amazing investment. So again, I turned to my accountant partner. I said, listen, do you mind if I kind of break this down? She said, no, no problem. So I did this. I highlighted to him that he forgot several large items when calculating how much money his son had made on this supposed investment. By the way, it's not an investment. It's the place where he was raising his family. So to the extent you have a family to raise or you need somewhere to live, like I said, you should go and buy a piece of residential real estate. But the gentleman was selling it to me as if it was an investment, hence why I answered him as if it was an investment. And I said, sir, you forgot $300,000 in stamp duty. You forgot about $10,000 a year in rates and in insurance. You did mention the $200,000 renovation, but you also forgot about $150,000 in the real estate agent fees when you sold the home. Sorry, could someone flip to the next slide? Apologies, I'm going to keep doing this. So the real cost of this home was not $5.95 million. I apportioned the stamp duty and half of the ongoing costs to the purchase price. And then I apportioned the other half of the rates and insurance, the renovation and the real estate agent fees to the sale proceeds. So the real cost of this home was not $5.95 million. It was really $6.275 million. And the sale proceeds were not $8 million. They were $7.625 million. Now, I'll note one thing. You will notice that I did not include any mortgage interest. I don't know whether the gentleman's son had a mortgage on this home or not, but truthfully, as you'll see in a minute, it doesn't matter. Right? The mortgage interest would only make this calculation worse. So the real profit that this gentleman made, or the gentleman's son made, was $1.35 million, which still sounds pretty good. But the truth is that if you annualize that profit, it's 3.97% a year. And then even if I just take out the costs, and if we just did the 5.95 and we did the 8, it turns out to be only 6.1%. Now, the problem with that is that back to my concept before about different levels of risk for the same amount of return, that's called risk-adjusted return. This risk-adjusted return is actually quite poor because the Australian Stock Exchange over the same period of time made 8.9%. The S&P 500 in the US made 12.5%, and the NASDAQ 100 in the US made 14.5%. So again, everyone needs somewhere to live, and everyone needs somewhere to raise a family if that's appropriate, if you've got a family. But my point is Australians have this habit of treating residential real estate as a great investment, and it's because they often miss the high costs. And if we flip the slide, I'll get to reason two. Reason two is the low level of liquidity. Now, the interesting thing about liquidity is it tends to only have two prices. It is either 0, no thanks, I don't need the liquidity, or it's 100, I need the liquidity yesterday. There's rarely a liquidity price in the middle. We should assign a price to liquidity because liquidity does have a price. And the problem with residential real estate, with all real estate, but in this case I'm talking about residential real estate, is that you can't sell a bedroom with a garage should you ever need some money from it. So right away, to the extent we should apportion a price of liquidity, that price in a piece of residential real estate is quite high because it's almost impossible to get liquidity out of it. You can, of course, do some kind of transaction where you take a loan, but again, it's difficult and it takes a long time. And the thing is when you're looking to buy a piece of property, depending on how picky you are or what the market looks like, it's going to take you somewhere between 6 weeks and 6 months. That's a long time. That's low liquidity given the alternatives. And then selling a property is relatively similar in that it's 6 weeks to maybe 10, maybe 12 weeks. So the reality is again, compared to the readily available alternatives, residential real estate has a very low level of liquidity. Because most people value liquidity at either 0 or 100, the real price is somewhere in the middle and people should price liquidity accordingly. And then reason 3 as to why residential real estate is a pretty subpar, again, relative to the other options, a subpar investment option is the low yields. So today, if you went and bought dividends in the ASX 200, you'd be getting a dividend yield of about 4.5%. Instead, if you ran off to a bank and wanted to get a term deposit, you'd be getting between 4.5% and 5%. When I put this together, it was about 4.85. The truth is the Federal Reserve in the US has lowered interest rates twice since then. The ECB has also lowered interest rates once. The Bank of New Zealand has lowered interest rates once. The Bank of Canada has lowered interest rates once. So as a result, that interest rate market is a global market. So if you went to get a term deposit today, you're probably going to get closer to 4%, and it's not going to be 4.85. And the thing about residential real estate yields currently, for the most part, if you've bought a great piece of real estate in a great spot, and there's been a lot of competition to buy that piece of real estate, your yield, if you rented it out, quite frankly, your net yield is potentially going to start with a 2. It is likely to start with a 3, and rarely is it ever going to start with a 4. So, the stars have all got to align relatively perfectly to start with a 4. And remember that when you look at that, the environment and that landscape, to get, a real estate yield that is probably going to start with a 3, but may start with a 2, and if you're lucky, starts with a 4, is that the RBA cash rate today is 4.35%. The inflation rate is somewhere in the high 3s. At the moment, it's maybe more like 3.6 and 3.8, but still, it's in the mid to high 3s. And your home mortgage rate is 6.05%. So when you put the residential real estate yield in context with those other available yields, it's all of a sudden not necessarily a great yield. And pretty much those are the 3 reasons that residential real estate doesn't always offer the great investment option that maybe some people think it is. And just to recap, it's that when people invest in residential real estate, they always forget the costs, and the costs are high, whether it's to buy it, whether it's to hold it, whether it's to maintain it, or whether it's to sell it. The second reason is that there is literally no input for liquidity, and liquidity in itself is a risk. And so if you need money quickly out of real estate, it's hard to get. And so we should price that. And the third reason is the relatively low yield. Should you go ahead and rent out that piece of real estate, take out all the costs, and then take your money.
So obviously, we do know that there are high costs of living at the moment. It is making it more difficult for people to actually enter the market, especially first home buyers. It's difficult for many people at the moment. So I would agree with 10% probably being that amount. We've got high interest rates, which are capping a lot of people out of the market at the moment.
I think it's really interesting because the housing market, so much of government policy focuses on the demand side. The ALP, the current ALP government, wants to help you get into it by them taking a piece of the equity so they can help you get in. The old coalition government wanted to let you access your super to get in. And look, maybe these are wonderful ideas. I suspect they're not. Frankly, it's because they hit the demand side. The problem with real estate prices are pretty much entirely functional on one side, and it's not demand. It's the supply side. So what happens is until state governments can release, can structure policy in a way that releases supply, lowers the costs required to get into supply. And then the last one is just immigration. The truth is if you want to go and listen, I wrote a piece on this on Livewire. If you want to look me up on livewiremarkets.com.au, this is entirely about supply, and a huge part of supply is the current migration story in Australia. We've just got a high level of migration, and if you want to follow migration, there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I've got no problem with it. But one of the knock-on impacts of that is the impact it has on residential real estate, and that is purely a supply story. We are crafting a situation in Australia where demand is very high and supply is not very high. And all that's going to do is lead to high prices. And until that gets fixed, prices are going to keep going up. And for anyone who if you've got kids or clients or people on this call are trying to get into the market, the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. Because there's no structural ability for this market to correct in a way that prices will even stabilise and go down.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Seb. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Seb, for presenting with me. Appreciate your time.
See you guys.
Thank you. See you later. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Property Power Talks. We hope you found today's insights valuable and engaging. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. For more information or to connect with our expert team at MB Property Law, then please visit our website at noborderslawgroup.com.au. We look forward to having you join us next time for more expert advice and actionable strategies to master the world of property law. Until then, stay informed and stay empowered.